Hi friends, my name is Jenny and I'm back today to do another video. Today I'm going to be doing my mid-month wrap-up for October. I'm filming several videos today, so I'm hoping to make all of the videos that I film relatively short, so hopefully we can get through the 5 books that I've read since my September wrap-up, which I'll put a link to in the cards above, as well as my October TBR track will also be linked in the cards above, as well as the description box below. So I'm hoping to get through these 5 books that I've finished since that video relatively quickly, as well as briefly touch on the 3 books that I'm currently reading. It is the 17th of October right now, and then the 3 books that I will likely be picking up within the next couple of days. So the first book that I finished since my September wrap-up was The Potlikker Papers, A Food History of the Modern South by John T. Edge. This one I've talked about several times on my channel as I've read it over the course of, I believe, a month or slightly over a month. But in case you are not familiar with this book, this basically is a cultural history of the American Southeast through the lens of food and cooking, beginning in the 1960s and continuing all the way to the present day. And I really enjoyed this one, as I believe I've talked about a fair amount on my channel. I am a big fan of cooking. I'm quite a home chef, amateur chef, whatever you want to call it. I cook pretty regularly and love exploring recipes, particularly recipes that have an interesting cultural tradition, and obviously Southern cooking is one that has an immensely interesting cultural tradition. And I also am a big fan of the South and think it is a really interesting cultural place. So this book kind of was right up my alley in both of those ways, and John T. Edge definitely did not disappoint. I think John T. Edge explores in this work something that I am also very interested in, which is the ways in which Southern culture, as well as, Southern food more specifically, has both been a means to perpetuate white supremacy and racism, but also a way to fight against white supremacy and racism and be anti-racist. So I thought the way that he tracks the history of those two ideas through Southern cooking from the civil rights movement to the present day was really well done and interesting. He also does this through profiling a number of different interesting both chefs and gardeners and kind of return to the land activists, as well as a number of kind of big cultural icons within Southern cooking, and then also culinary historians, many of which I was familiar with, such as Fannie Lou Hamer, who was an activist in the civil rights movement, who was particularly interested in issues of hunger in Mississippi. Harlan Sanders, who is the founder of KFC Fried Chicken. Ed Mitchell, who is a pretty famous barbecue pitmaster in North Carolina, who was actually profiled in Michael Pollan's Cooked miniseries that was on Netflix several years ago, and that's how I learned about him. Michael Twitty, who I really enjoy. I've not read his book, The Cooking Gene, but that's one that I'm definitely interested in reading, particularly after reading this. And then Sean Brock, who's a chef that was originally based in Charleston and now I believe is in Nashville, whose work I really enjoy, and I actually have one of his cookbooks. So there's a lot of interesting cultural icons and people in the food world that I have already really appreciated, and so learning more about them through these kind of mini biographies that are encapsulated in each chapter was really helpful. I will say, however, that I do think some of the chapters, while intended to be tied together thematically, didn't quite work for me. That's in part why I knocked it down a half star, just because some of the chapters I do think could have benefited from being split into 2 separate chapters as opposed to tying them together. But overall, I really enjoyed this book, would highly recommend it for Nonfiction November. If you're looking for a book on either history or food, I think this one does a phenomenal job. And yeah, John T. Edge in general, I think, is very honest about the history of racism in the South and how much of a role that plays in creating the culture of the South, but also is very hopeful and optimistic about the South's role in creating kind of an anti-racist society. So yeah, I was really impressed by this. John T. Edge is a white author, just in case anyone was interested in that, but I do think he is very aware of issues of social equity and racism. So I was super appreciative of that aspect of this, and in general would just really recommend this. John T. Edge also is the co-founder, I believe, and president of the Southern Foodways Alliance, which is a center out of Ole Miss in Mississippi that basically kind of tries to archive the cultural history of food in the South, which is super fascinating and would highly suggest checking out their work as well. They also put a podcast out that John T. Edge is the host for, and so I was familiar with his voice and thereby chose to listen to this on audio, which I would also recommend both the podcast and the audiobook version of this book. So there's the first one that I finished this month. The next book that I finished was an early copy sent to me through NetGalley, and it came out on the 6th of October, so it's available now. And it's quite a buzzy book. It was an October pick for Book of the Month, and I've just kind of seen it in a lot of places, so you probably have already heard of this one, but it was Leave the World Behind by Wherein I. And this one was disturbing, I think is the best way to describe it. It is a kind of mystery thriller, almost turned horror. I think Get Out is a good way to describe it, except it doesn't have the jump scares that Get Out does, in that it is about this white family that is going to Long Island to a remote beach house where they're going to spend the week and kind of, you know, have a vacation, normal vacation. But the black, older, wealthy owners of the house arrive on like the second or third day of the vacation, saying that there's been a blackout in New York City. No one really knows what's happening, but they've come here because they feel safe here. It's their home. And so initially the two families, the older black couple and the white parents of two, you know, early teen, preteen children, are pretty suspicious of one another, particularly the white family of the black family. They don't believe that the older black couple are the owners of the house. There's kind of some confusion there, but the kind of themes of racism and privilege to me kind of start to fall away a bit as the characters become more comfortable with one another, but also as the situation becomes more and more strange and dire as we slowly kind of unveil the fact that obviously something very terrifying and apocalyptic is happening, but the people in the house have no idea what's going on, and you as the reader don't really either. Occasionally there's a somewhat removed, very nonchalant narrator that comes in and describes what's happening elsewhere in the world, such as people dying in elevators or in the subway in New York City, people in Idaho learning about this thing during the middle of the novel is a very strange noise that causes ramifications globally. And so there's a lot of weird stuff that you as the reader are getting glimpses of, but really don't know anything about, nor do the characters. So it gives the perfect sense, I think, of the like creepy uncertainty and just kind of despair and hopelessness that has come with like what I put in my review as quote unquote pandemic times, of just not knowing what anything will be like when we kind of get out of this, slash are we ever going to get out of this, that I thought was so accurate to how we as Americans and we as a like global society are feeling with the pandemic, that I was pretty disturbed just because it did pinpoint that emotion so well. And I think if you are in the kind of midst of feeling that way, and particularly if it's causing you to have like anxiety or depression, I would steer clear of this book because I think it will only play into your fears and kind of manifestations more than you probably need right now. But if you're willing to go on the thought train with Alam, I definitely think it's worth it. It's a really fascinating book. It's not hopeful at all, so like don't expect happy times to happen and Leave the World Behind, but it's a fascinating examination of these feelings of terror and uncertainty alongside a really interesting discussion about race. So all in all, I would really recommend this one, but it was quite disturbing, so do tread with caution because I like still feel unnerved just like thinking about this book and like what's happening, and things do get a little like off the rails towards the end as well. So if you're really not into horror, I'm usually not, it's really not my cup of tea and I could handle this one, but if it's really something that makes you uncomfortable, then I would probably steer clear of this one and maybe look up some trigger warnings. I would still recommend it. It was really fascinating little exercise, and definitely I think I read another review that was like, this is the first book that really encapsulates pandemic literature and what pandemic literature will be like. But actually Alam started it pre-pandemic. It was kind of more rumination generally on Trump's America that obviously became more and more relevant as the pandemic settled in. So yeah, would highly recommend this one, but it was pretty disturbing. Oh, and then finally, as I said, this was an early copy sent to me through NetGalley from HarperCollins, and it's published by Echo, and it's out now, so you can read this one at your leisure. The next one was also published by Echo and sent to me as an early copy, and that was The Fragile Earth, Writings from the New Yorker on Climate Change. I've talked about this one, I feel like 500 times on my channel, so I'm really not going to go into depth about it, particularly as I have an upcoming video about climate change nonfiction recommendations for Nonfiction November. But I will just say I enjoyed this. I did have a few problems with some of the solutions put forth by some of the authors in this collection, but overall I think the New Yorker has some great science writers on their staff. In general, I just think the New Yorker has some of the best like living contemporary American nonfiction journalists writing today alongside The Atlantic. But I overall really enjoyed this. The articles are really well researched. I think that you could read any of the articles going in with very limited knowledge of what they're talking about, get a fair grasp on the particular issue being presented regarding climate change in that essay, and overall I would enjoy it. It is a journey. It's 560 pages according to Goodreads, and it definitely took me quite a long time to get through, so if you do decide to take on this one, just know it's gonna be a project. But yeah, I gave this one 4 stars. I enjoyed it. I can't remember if I said that I gave Leave the World Behind 4 stars, but I did. Then finally, the next book that I read, and actually I talked about this book as well as the 2 previous books, Leave the World Behind and The Fragile Earth, in my fall break reading vlog, which I will put a link to up in the cards above. But the next book I finished was Cantoris by Carolina de Robertis, and I love this one. I gave it 5 stars, definitely one of my favorite books of the year so far. So this book is a literary historical fiction novel that follows 5 queer women living in the dictatorship in Uruguay in the 1970s, and the amount of research, both historical and ethnographic, from what it sounds like from the author's note, that Carolina de Robertis did on this time period and on queer women's stories during this time was just so well blended into the narrative. I do find sometimes that a historical fiction book that's based on true events or true people feels too coincidental that a person is involved in this famous other person's life. I would say almost that's more par for the course in terms of historical fiction, but I personally did not feel that way at all. There are some major events, or I guess just one major event or kind of person that is involved in the story, but I think the way it's involved was tied so seamlessly into the narrative that it felt so realistic, and I think that was true of the fictionalized versions of this book as well. It just, the emotions presented and the characters' development and reaction to things just felt so raw and honest that I just loved it. I thought it was so well done. I really wish it would have stuck around in the BookTube Prize, which I talked a bit about in that reading vlog that I linked up above. But in general, just the writing was beautiful. The amount of observation that went into kind of the details of the story I thought was really well done. This is kind of a very detail-oriented, character-driven story, but not in a way that feels kind of overly burdensome. And yeah, in general, I just absolutely love this one. There was like a minor subplot that took place over the course of maybe 5 pages halfway in the middle of the story and then was tied up right in the last 10 or so pages, and the final page where it got tied up honestly made me tear up, which for a single page to make you tear up in a novel I feel like has to be a winner. And yeah, I just really enjoyed this one. I think it rings true, similar to Leave the World Behind, in its explorations of despair and uncertainty, but this one is tinged with so much hopefulness and inspiration, especially I think in part because it is a historical fiction novel, and so the characters, as we know from history, do end up, the dictatorship ends up falling, and they did return to democracy after their dictatorship, and so obviously that does tinge the book with a kind of hopeful, positive outcome. But I think the ways that they are just trying to survive amid all this uncertainty and despair, particularly given the more and more totalitarian regime that we seem to be living under here in the United States, it felt really comforting to read a book where the characters kind of maintained hope through the dictatorship, but then also are able to live past the dictatorship. I would highly recommend this one. I gave it 5 stars. Definitely going to be on my favorite list of the year so far. And so the final book that I finished during this first half of the month of October is Out of Darkness Shining Light by Bettina Gappa, which I should have a review of up on my channel. It should be the most recent video that I've just posted, so I'll put a link to it in the cards above. I enjoyed this one. I gave it 3.5 stars and talk about my thoughts more in that video, which is part of my African Women Writers Project. So yeah, did enjoy this one, gave it 3.5 stars. Then I have 3 books that I'm currently reading, as well as 3 books that I'm probably going to start within the next couple of days. The first of which that I'm currently reading is The Midnight Bargain by C.L. Polk. This one I'm about halfway done with, and I'm actually really enjoying. I read for about 45 minutes last night, and I think that more extended time with it did help me enjoy it a lot more. And this is quite a genre bending book. It's primarily a fantasy book, I would say, but it has very strong historical elements. There's a lot of terminology that's used in here that is historically accurate, particularly to, I believe, the 18th century Regency period in England. And then there's also strong romantic elements to this book. So while I don't think it's necessarily a fantasy romance, it definitely does have strong romantic elements. And at first I was not particularly engaged with the romance part of it. I initially thought this book, and I believe I said this book was a queer romance, but it's not. It's between a man and a woman, which is fine. I mean, a lot of the romances I read are between men and women, but I was surprised and somewhat disappointed about that at first. But now I'm all on board the romance train. I definitely enjoy the two main romantic leads, and I think their chemistry and their understandings of one another are really well done. And yeah, I'm enjoying this one. It has some interesting social commentary as well that I think is getting more and more nuanced and interesting. So yeah, overall, I'm enjoying this one. I probably will finish it in the next couple of days. So if you are desperate to see my final thoughts on this, definitely check out my Goodreads, as I write reviews for all the books that I read, and I post them shortly after finishing them. So I always have my Goodreads linked down in the description box below if you're interested in getting those play-by-play thoughts about any of the books that I read. And The Midnight Bargain was an early copy sent to me from Airborne that is now out. It came out this past Tuesday, October 13th. And then I also have another one that came out this past Tuesday, October 13th, which is Brave New Home by Diana Lind. And this one I'm about a quarter of the way through, really enjoying, super thought-provoking. I also went to an event with Diana and another author slash academic named Bruce Katz, and the two of them had such a fascinating discussion about the future of housing and current trends in housing, which is also what Diana Lind's book is about. I'm currently in the historical section of like the history of the single family home in the United States. I'm about to get to the 2009 recession and how that impacted housing, so I'm super intrigued about that. And yeah, enjoying this one quite a lot. Definitely feeds into a lot of my nonfiction interests, and I should be finishing this one soon once I have kind of a bigger chunk of time to really dig into this one. Then the next book that I'm currently reading is Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. I have only read about 30 pages of this one, and honestly I might give up on it and not haul it, just because that first 30 pages were very slow and quite a trek to get through. However, I am going to give this one another like 50 to 70 pages and then decide if it's getting kind of interesting enough that I want to continue on with it. So that's that one. I will kind of keep you updated if I end up DNFing this one or if I continue with it. Then finally, as I said, I have 3 books that I'm hoping to start within the next couple of days. The first of which I will likely start later today, since I just finished Out of Darkness Shining Light this morning, which was Gingerbread by Helen Oyeyemi. This one I talked about in my October TBR talk, which as I said will be linked up above. And yeah, I'm excited about this one. It's pretty short. It should be fun. And then I'm also hoping to start my November pick for the African Women Writers Project, The Old Drift by Namwali Serpell, in the next couple of days, just because this one is quite long and I've been kind of pushing the boundaries on like when I said I would put those reviews up for my African Women Writers Project. So I want to get a kind of head start on this one, especially because it's particularly long and I have probably a busy like next month ahead. So I wanted to get started on this one, but super excited about this one. I've talked about this one in those African Women Writers Project videos, but this is another literary historical fiction novel set in Zambia and discussing the kind of foundations of the country of Zambia. So super excited about that. And then the final book that I'm interested in getting to in the next couple of days is The Bright and Breaking Sea by Chloe Neal. This one doesn't come out till November 17th, but I am anticipating it and kind of want to get ahead of this one before it comes out. And this is another fantasy romance, or potentially historical romance. I'm pretty sure there's fantasy elements to it, that is about a female pirate. So I'm excited about this one. Comes out from Berkeley, as I said, on November 17th, and I got an early copy of this one through NetGalley as always. So those are all the books that I've read in this first half of October, slash I'm currently reading, slash I'm about to read. Let me know if any of these books sound interesting to you, or books that you've read and have thoughts about, down in the comment section below. Additionally, if you have found my channel through this video, I'd love to have you stick around and subscribe. And I think that's everything. I will talk to you next time.